You are about to watch a short clip from the morning of Saturday, March 7th. The night before, two large Toronto area synagogues had been shot up with bullets. A third synagogue had been attacked earlier in the week. The speaker, you will see, is Hank Idsinga, a 34-year veteran of the Toronto Police Force who rose to one of the top positions, Chief of Homicide. Hank Idsinga has a lot to say about institutional antisemitism in the Toronto Police Force. Beginning with this, he told me that he was not surprised to wake up on Saturday, March 7th and hear about the synagogue shootings. What else?
Shocking, obviously, devastated. These literally are terrorism offenses. It's something that the entire nation here should be focused on and should be shutting down. But unfortunately, these mindsets have been really enabled through the lack of enforcement over the last 2.5 years, and really empowers the people who are doing this to do it and to continue to do it.
Idsinga also published a book recently. It's called The High Road: Confessions of a Homicide Cop, which has soared to bestseller status overnight. In addition to being a compelling true crime read, Idsinga's book is a harsh indictment of an anti-Semitic culture in the Toronto Police Force, and he knows of what he speaks. The reaction to the book from senior Toronto Police leadership has been swift and dismissive. Some typical comments from top brass: why didn't he raise his concerns at the time? He's just looking to stir controversy, to sell books. Well, as it happens, Idsinga did report concerns while on the force, as have others. I'll leave it to Hank Idsinga to explain in this podcast what happens to those who dare to step out of line and speak the truth to power. And frankly, all you have to do is look at how Toronto police have treated the Jewish community in the city since October 7th. It's shameful, and the conduct speaks for itself. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. Okay, we're going to take a brief pause here for orientation. This podcast came together over a period of 2 months. In part 1, I discuss with our guest today, Hank Idsinga, his recent book exposing anti-Semitism in the upper ranks of the Toronto Police Force, and why Toronto has become one of the most dangerous cities in the world in which to be a Jew. To put it bluntly, Jewish Torontonians do not feel that they enjoy the same level of protection from the police as others might. Being a Jew is a liability in Toronto today, and the interview with Hank Idsinga for part 1, when we discussed this topic and more, was done recently on May 3rd. Part 2 of the podcast is very brief. It is the reason that I held this podcast for another day. I was originally going to publish it yesterday on Sunday. But then I saw the clip from a press conference held by the Deputy Chief of Toronto Police, among others in senior leadership. I thought it was interesting, and it shows how the Deputy Chief responds to a question from an independent journalist, Ezra Levant. The unbridled contempt. Now, Ezra Levant is a controversial figure to some, and I get into that a bit. But that is not why he is being ignored by Toronto Police. He is being ignored because he is holding them to account. I don't care what anyone thinks of Ezra Levant or his journalism, including the police. The police have a job. Their job is to serve and protect, and that includes Jews. And they have not done that job for more than 2 years now, and we are owed an explanation. Part 3 of the podcast is not to be missed, truly. It's an interview I did with Hank Idsinga on the morning of Saturday, March 7th, hours after 2 synagogues had been shot up with bullets. Hank and I get into how Toronto police have simply allowed anti-Semitic thugs to harass Jews since October 7th, pretty much unimpeded. There's always a reason to protect the violent thugs and Jew haters, and there's always a reason to yell at Jews, to be quiet, to allow the haters to roam freely through their neighborhoods with hate speech on signs and yelled and amplified with megaphones. There's always a reason to tell Jews to get off the sidewalk and let the haters pass freely. That's what one police officer refers to as keeping the peace. It's all on video. I mean, this is all documented. Have a look at the podcast episodes I post in the show notes. It's really time to use our collective voices, not just Jews, not just in Toronto, everyone, everywhere. Okay, so the 3 parts to this podcast are now clear. I have also included timestamps in the show notes so that you can jump around at your own pace. But really, part 3 is super interesting and not to be missed. Finally, I would like to express deep appreciation to my dear friend Andrea Marcus, a lifelong Torontonian who has been a stalwart supporter of State of Tel Aviv and beyond in so many ways. She is also an insanely talented artist. Insane. We'll talk about that another day. Andrea very generously sponsored this episode, as she has done previously. After listening to the last podcast episode featuring Israeli ministers Shikli and Haskell, Andrea phoned me to tell me how moved she was by the clear, direct presentation of facts and truth. So, thank you, Andrea, for helping to make this work possible with your generous support. It means the world. And if any of you listening would like to sponsor future podcast episodes, please reach out to me directly. Vivian@stateoftelaviv.com. And by the way, it's a big podcast week this week. Tomorrow, I'm going to be dropping an episode that was taped last night with a State of Tel Aviv and beyond regular guest, Jonathan Henriques. The topic, Iran. We're going to zoom out from Toronto. Okay, so this is the end of the administrative portion of the podcast. I thought it was necessary given how long it is and that there are sort of 3 distinct parts to this episode. So get ready, buckle up. The gloves are off today. Starting now. It seems that almost every day recently I see or hear about a new podcast or an article somewhere offering insight into the endemic antisemitism in Canada, particularly in Toronto. It's great that all sorts of people in Toronto, America, and beyond are paying attention, but it's kind of odd to hear them reporting on how bad things are as if this is something new. I mean, it's not. This is old news. I've been writing about this for decades, speaking about it for decades, dealing with it for decades. I've been involved with fighting it for decades. Let's start, just for fun, in 2014. I experienced profound, entrenched Jew hatred during my tenure as the Canadian ambassador to Israel, and it was most pronounced at the highest levels of the Canadian Public Service, in the Privy Council office and the Department of Foreign Affairs. And you know what? It's an open secret in Ottawa that the Mandarins tend to loathe Israel and aren't the biggest fans of Jews. It's known. The things that senior public servants said and did were shocking. Jewish public servants, some retired, some still in the system, have contacted me over the years to share their experiences. Chronic, unabashed Jew hatred. Many felt that their careers had been stymied because they were Jews. I can tell you that based on my experiences when in office, I have no reason to question the veracity of what these people told me. And I believe that if Canadians understood the entrenched hatred that permeates the public service ranks, I'd like to think that they too would be horrified. I'll tell you something else. No one, I mean no one, wanted to hear the truth about Ottawa 10 years ago. Absolutely no one. Jew hatred in Canada is nothing new. So we should stop speaking about it as if it's some crazy thing that just came out of nowhere. It's always been there, and it's not just a problem with the Toronto Police. I think that the context that I just provided is important to keep in mind as you listen to my 2 interviews with Hank Idsinga. This podcast episode today builds on the one in which we spoke at length with 2 senior Israeli political figures. The Minister of Diaspora Affairs and Combating Antisemitism, Amichai Shikli, and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sharon Haskell. Today, we go more local and speak to a Canadian who has a fascinating past and deep knowledge of the way in which law enforcement in Canada's largest city, Toronto, with a population of approximately 250,000 Jews, well, Hank Idsinga talks about how the Toronto Police Force deals with Jews. As Canadians have a habit of doing, or did in the past, we prefer to deliver harsh messages in softer tones, and I'm kind of done with sanding down the edges. They're sharp today. Antisemitism in Canada has become the topic du jour, the trend of the moment. But this is not just about Canada. It's about the very thin line between democracy and fascism. It's about willful blindness, which afflicts Western societies at epidemic levels. And it is about Canada and how the 4th largest Jewish community in the world came to find itself in a quite horrible position. Because it did not just happen. People let it happen. Hank Idsinga's new book is making big waves in the Toronto Police Force and beyond. The Toronto Police Force, by the way, is the 4th largest in North America, after New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Toronto is big, and Toronto Police Service has presided over a shameful period in which violent Jew hatred has become normalized under their watch. It was only when the conduct of Toronto police became an international story in early March, after a rash of synagogue shootings and more, that they even pretended to care about antisemitism. Of course, I have to include the caveat that there are many good professional police officers in the Toronto force. I'm sure of it. But what seems to be prevalent, particularly among the top leadership, is that, well, there's a Jewish problem in the Toronto Police Service. I've been speaking with Hank Idsinga for some time now, even before I knew he was writing a book. We discussed law and order issues, specific issues regarding law and policing in Toronto, connected to the way in which police were seemingly allowing Jew haters to pretty much run rampant in the city since October 7th. When it came to the safety of Jews, there was always a but. But freedom of speech. But Islamophobia. But this and but that. They never run out of buts. But through all the shootings and firebombings and assaults and vandalism and bullying, there was never this from Toronto Police. But this is not legal conduct. This contravenes multiple provisions in the Criminal Code of Canada, not to mention a slew of other laws. Or, as Hank Idsinga remarked in the opening to this podcast, this is terrorism. And as I've been writing for years, this is a national security issue. Toronto Police and their chief, Myron Demkew, and his senior leaders never said things like that. Their preferred approach has been, we're trying to keep the peace. And with the greatest respect to Chief Demkew, that's a load of hooey. As I've covered in numerous podcasts with video clips, Toronto police were and are more likely to berate Jews for having the temerity to complain. They yell at the Jews. They treat them with open contempt. And at the same time, they coddle the antisemites who have taken control of the streets and who particularly like to roam around Jewish residential neighborhoods and intimidate random civilians. Have a look at the show notes to this episode, where I include links to some past episodes on this topic. It's unreal what Toronto police have allowed to go on. This podcast is comprised of 2 interviews I did with Hank Idsinga, one on Saturday, March 7th, just hours after news broke of 2 synagogue shootings, and the second, more recently, on May 3rd, immediately following the publication of his book. Fun fact, Hank is wearing the same shirt in both interviews, which I have to say confused me for a moment when editing, but it really was 2 different days, 2 different interviews. Sunday, May 3rd, Hank Idsinga. Thank you for making time today to speak with State of Tel Aviv and beyond.
Hey, Vivian, it's an absolute pleasure to chat with you again.
I've been looking forward to this chat for quite some time. I did read, thank you for the advanced copy of your book, which was launched 2 weeks ago now, Hank? How long ago?
Not even a week.
Your book is #1 in Canada, and I'm going to conjecture that it's going to be there for quite some time. The whole book is fantastic, but it's your opening, I don't know, 40, 50 pages that just totally captured me and captivated, really hooked me. Who is Hank, and why did you write this book, Hank?
Yeah, well, Hank is the grandson of a Holocaust victim named Arthur Jacobs, who was born in Heiligenhaus in Germany, and who married he was a German World War I Iron Cross winning veteran. And he was one of 5 siblings born to Solomon Jacobs in Heiligenhaus, very well-established family. And he married my Catholic grandmother in 1931. And they had 3 children, Klaus, Louise, and my mom, the youngest, Leni, who was born in 1934. So obviously the Nazis came to power in 1933 in Germany. And my grandfather thought he would be protected because of his veteran status, but ultimately he was arrested and put into the concentration camp system in 1938, in the fall of 1938. So living through losing everything and ending up living in a spare bedroom in their friend's apartment in Heiligenhaus, my grandmother and the 3 kids, and it was still so dangerous, especially after Kristallnacht in November 1938, where the people that they're living with ended up being murdered. They were taken from their house, bound together, sacks over their head, and thrown into the river. So my grandmother, realizing the danger that the kids were in, would wake them up before dawn every morning, take them to a local forest. They would spend their day playing and learning in the forest, and then she would bring them back after dark. So that's how they spent a cold winter of 1938, 1939. And then in 1939, she brought them to the train station in Dusseldorf and put them on transport trains where they were taken to Holland and eventually put into Catholic orphanages. So my mother just had a horrible childhood growing up in a Catholic orphanage as being half Jew. So she was abused for that by the nuns and, of course, abused by the other children because she was German. And her mother, she last saw in 1940, came to visit them in Holland and overstayed her visa, so she was arrested by Dutch authorities and wasn't allowed to come back into Holland until after the war. And she never made it back because she died of cancer shortly after the war. So my mother made her way to Canada in 1961. She had trained as a nurse in Europe, came to Canada where she met my father, who is as Dutch can be, had come here in the 1950s, and myself and my sisters were born in the mid to late 1960s. And by the time I was 10 or 11, beginning to recognize the history and the trauma that my mother had been through, I declared to her that I wanted to invoke a career that would catch the bad guys. I had read a Time magazine article in 1978 about Simon Wiesenthal's hunt for Joseph Mengele. And I said, that's what I want to do. And she said, well, the Nazis are all going to be dead by the time you're old enough. And prophetically, unfortunately, she was quite wrong about that. But I still wanted to do something to catch the bad guys. So I joined the Toronto Police Service in 1989. Spent 34 years policing in Toronto, and the last 18 years of my career were spent working in homicide, and the last 5 of those as the unit commander of the homicide squad, which we built into one of the most successful, if not the most successful, homicide squad on the continent.
We're going to focus on some very niche parts of the book and the aftermath, the sort of blowback since it's been published. And locally in Toronto, over the last week or so, you've obviously been out doing interviews, and you've made some quite straightforward comments. And we're going to show one right now from, I believe it was your first interview with the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Let's watch the clip.
I have not stepped foot in police headquarters since September 22nd of 2023, and I don't think I would be welcome back at police headquarters.
Imagine that from the man who was once the most well-known cop in Canada's biggest city. Homicide Inspector Hank Idsinga.
We've never seen anything quite like this.
A senior officer working on some of the most notable crime cases in Toronto,
It's a serial killer.
including the investigation into serial killer Bruce McArthur. Proud to be a cop, but proud of the Toronto Police Service, he worries about that force and bigotry.
I could write a book centered around that topic.
Racism, antisemitism.
Racism, antisemitism, tyrannical behavior, corruption, dysfunction in the senior ranks.
He did write a book about his 34 years in policing.
A witness actually sees him putting his Walkman headphones on. He was charged with first-degree murder.
Cases solved, those that haunt. That he called his book The High Road, sign enough he didn't entirely expose what or who enraged him.
When I was the inspector.
What he is willing to say is bad enough.
I don't go around telling people, my grandfather was a Holocaust victim. So people, when they don't know my background, perhaps let their guard down a little bit. There was an officer in the ranks above me who referred to a kosher barbecue as a Jew-Q. And I kind of said, you think that's really an appropriate term? And they were like, oh yes, it's hilarious. I thought, no, it's not so funny, right? Considering 20th century history. And I kind of left that alone. And it was months later when there was a video on our internal intranet, and one of the officers featured in the video, unbeknownst to me at the time, was Jewish. And I walked in on the same senior officer who was watching that video, and they paused that video and looked at me and gestured towards the screen and said, the only reason he gets away with this is because he's a fucking Jew. And that blew me away.
Hank, I know that you've done so many interviews, and that particular interview that you did with the CBC was about 2 hours long. So the part that we're going to focus on, I just want to make very clear to our listeners, is a very small part, but it relates to the topic, of course, of this particular podcast episode. And that was, as we just showed, where you stated very clearly that in your view, there is quite embedded, entrenched anti-Semitism in the Toronto police force, and in particular among leadership. And of course, there was a strong reaction to that from the police force. But tell us first, why did you say that?
Well, it's a first-hand comment, right? And I'm aware of other incidents that have been related to me by other officers that I don't have firsthand. Those comments were made right in front of me, right to my face. And it really affected how the last few years of my career played out. So when I was first approached to write the book, the publisher wanted a memoir of true crime stories. And I said, well, if I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write a memoir. And if I'm going to write a memoir, I'm putting my grandfather and my mother's story as the opening, and I'm putting the anti-Semitism within the police service as the closing, because I think it's tragically ironic that this happened, right? And certainly I left the police service the month, well, literally a week and a half before October 7th happened, 2 weeks beforehand. So sitting back at home and seeing what was unfolding on the streets of Toronto and what has been widely criticized as the lack of police response to that, it really, and I think I put one sentence in the book, if you're wondering why the police aren't doing anything when they should be doing something, here's a story for you. And really, even now in 2026, I'm still contacted by Jewish officers and female officers and black officers within the police service with Me Too stories. And it's still happening.
It's still happening. Of course it's still happening. And here's another vignette Hank Idsinga tells involving the same senior officer.
A few months later, we had to give a presentation to a civilian lawyer at police headquarters. And I was in the elevator with that same officer, and they said, I can't believe we have to pander to this fucking Jew. And elevator doors opened. There were quite a few officers in the room. And I sat off to the side and I kept my head down and I didn't say a thing. I literally felt nauseous to my stomach through that presentation. And I made it known very clearly that unless it's necessary through the chain of command, I want nothing to do with that particular senior officer. And the repercussions just for doing that were pretty obvious over the next couple of years. I mean, I was ostracized. The office, the homicide squad was ostracized. There were numerous instances where, quite frankly, the chiefs should have stood up and applauded what was going on in the homicide squad, and they never did. And officers in the squad were coming to me like, what's going on? We're doing this fabulous work. We're not hearing anything. As a matter of fact, we're hearing some negative comments. And I said, we've really got to separate ourselves from the politics and the tyrannical behavior that's going on in the ranks above us and just focus on what we're doing, because we're doing it very well. And that's what we need to really separate from the dysfunction in other areas of the service. And we did, and we excelled at what we were doing. So very proud of that. But obviously, the last couple of years for me were quite miserable within the organization. And I was happy to get out at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024.
You faced a really strong backlash after you made the comments on the CBC in that interview. What can you tell us about the general nature of the blowback? And I'm particularly interested in whether or not there was anything said, any official statement, response from Toronto Police Services.
Yeah, you know what? I did that interview with CBC about 2 weeks before the book release. And CBC released a teaser on the Wednesday morning before the book release, which would have been the 22nd of April. And it contained some of those remarks by me extracted from the interview. And later that afternoon, I received an email from the chief superintendent in charge of professionalism and accountability. And it had a letter attached to it inviting me to come in. We're aware of your allegations and we're inviting you to come in for a voluntary interview so that we can have an investigation night. I didn't respond to that letter and that email at all, because I make it pretty clear in the interview that was being aired that night that I would not trust in any internal review or investigation into comments like this. The next day, 2 officers from the same unit knocked on my door and hand-delivered me a copy of the same letter. And I said to them, I know exactly what's going on with the police service right now. They're trying to create a paper trail, and they want to publicly be able to say, Mr. Idsinga should have said something in 2020. He's declining to have an investigation conducted. So I said to these officers, all due respect, and, sorry that you've been put in this position, but I won't be responding, and, give my best to the chief superintendent of professional standards, who I know quite well, and worked with on a couple of during my time with the police service.
Hank Idsinga now tells us what happened one day after the CBC interview aired.
So that day, the deputies from the Toronto Police Service, Rob Johnson and Frank Burrito, started going to media outlets, and they obviously had some talking points. And those talking points included, we're not going to comment on allegations made by somebody who's obviously just promoting a book. So insinuating that this never happened and he's just trying to sell books, which is ridiculous, right? And then their second point was, he should have said something when this happened.
They're basically saying to you, why didn't you speak up at the time? These senior people, why didn't you take a position? And
exactly.
Okay.
But they can't say that.
Hank and I next discussed a case from November 2025. A mob of Jew haters attacked an IDF reserve soldier who was in Toronto to speak to a small group of university students. The attackers were violent and calling for his murder. It's all on video. The reservist, Jonathan Carton, was treated in hospital. State of Tel Aviv and Beyond covered this ongoing incident in 2 podcast episodes. You can check out the show notes for the links. The leader of the violent mob, Kabil Ibrahim, was known to police. He was charged at the time with ridiculously trivial offenses, reinforcing a well-established message that Jews in Toronto, they're fair game, have at 'em. But it's changed a little since international attention has been focused on Toronto police in the last few months. They seem to be very belatedly, kind of maybe changing their tune, clearly under duress. In the case of Jonathan Carton, in the last week or two, charges against Kabil Mohammed were upgraded. This is what Hank and I are discussing now.
Which, in my opinion, is still not enough, but, without getting too deep into the weeds there. So those charges that were laid in relation to that IDF officer and what happened in November of 2025, and now they've upgraded the charges. I mean, I've conducted murder investigations and I've laid murder charges, and it gets to the Crown and they say, okay, we should probably upgrade that or we should probably downgrade that. And they amend the indictment. But in this case, it's the police who have amended the charges, and whether that was at the behest of the Crown, we don't know. But it's certainly interesting timing in relation to the criticism against the police service as a result of the publishing of my book, the increase in the severity of some of the offenses that we're seeing, where there's now shootings going on in Toronto. But I agree with you 100%. This should have been happening on October 8th of 2023. Some of the things that we saw in the streets were left to go completely unchecked. And there's probably a multitude of reasons for that. And my position is the fact that there's antisemites in the police service from top to bottom would definitely contribute to the lack of action since 2023.
We conclude our discussion with Hank telling me about his appearance at an event hosted in a Toronto synagogue recently.
I went to a synagogue a few nights ago for a presentation, and you're probably familiar with it, Beth Tikva Synagogue on Bayview Avenue. And I pulled in there with my wife in the car, and the entire parking lot is barricaded.
Oh,
And
wow.
the reason it's barricaded is it forces you to drive down the north side of the building under some surveillance cameras so it can capture the car and who's in the car. You have to go all the way around the back and then come back in, park in the parking lot, and then going in through the doors. There's 2 security guards there. If your name's not on the list, you're not getting in. And they're going to wand you. And then a police officer is also there to make sure everything is kept secure, and the security guards are doing their job. Nobody should have to live like that, and they shouldn't have to pay on top of what they're already paying in taxes for their safety within the state to enhance that safety. And that's at every synagogue in the city.
And also, it's not just synagogues, it's also variations on that degree of security. Jewish day schools, which my children are now grown up, but even in their time, we had security, and I had to answer those questions to them. Mommy, why do we need security guards at our school? Community centers where I would take them for recreation. Why are there security guards? And it's only become worse. Thank you for writing this fantastic book and for doing all of the important work you do and stepping up, and you setting such a great example. And I have to say, I've been very inspired by your work. So thank you for doing it. Hank Idsinga, thank you so much for taking the time to speak today. Really appreciate it.
Really appreciate you having me on, Vivian, and I'll continue my advocacy and then some as a result of the book. So hopefully we have a positive impact on some of these institutional problems.
I know you will. We're going to have a short intermission here. This podcast that you're listening to and watching when I put up video clips, this podcast was done, put to bed, and then I saw this clip, and I had to include it. In recent weeks, it seems as if there are constant assaults and attacks on Jews in Toronto. Most of them seem to also target Orthodox Jews, the ones who are easily identifiable. In the last week, there have been several instances of pellet guns and other weapons being used to shoot at or in other ways harm young boys and men. Toronto Police held a press conference today, Sunday, May 10th, to announce an arrest in one of the cases. A local journalist, Ezra Levant, had some questions for them. Watch how they conduct themselves.
I have a question for the Deputy Chief. I've been about a half a dozen of these press conferences. The other day, a Jewish man was murdered execution style not far from here. Almost every day, there's a shooting of a Jew. A former senior officer in your police force says that anti-Semitism is now rooted within the police. At what point will you admit that you're either unable or unwilling to protect Toronto's Jews?
So I would ask everybody that's here today to focus on the investigation at hand. We're not going to be discussing what you're talking about. So if we could please just discuss what we're talking about here today.
I don't take direction from you on what I can
That's
talk
fine.
about.
Any
I
other
want
questions?
to know if you can protect Toronto's Jews.
The charges?
Why can you not protect Toronto's Jews? Like you're literally not going to answer that question. That's the basic question we're all here to answer.
Okay.
You don't have an answer?
Yeah, the name on the suspect and the name.
Yeah.
Now, there are some people who regard Ezra Levant as a lesser journalist, a right-wing extremist. In my experience, Ezra is sharp, ever polite, and professional, and he asks the questions that most journalists do not, because most journalists seem afraid of challenging authority, which is actually their job. Challenge authority and hold authority, power accountable. And good on Ezra. He mentions Hank Idsinga's characterization of the force having an antisemitism problem. They just ignore him. This happened today, Sunday, May 10th. It's unreal. It's like we're invisible. Now, back to our show with Hank Idsinga. Okay, I first interviewed Hank Idsinga for the show on March 7th. In the days following the spate of shooting of synagogues in Toronto. And guess what? A few arrests in connection with those shootings have been made in the last few days. Yep. And my sources tell me that the individuals arrested, they were known to police. So I'm wondering how long the police sat on the evidence that was sufficient for them to arrest and lay charges. It is curious that all of a sudden, after all this global attention focuses on Toronto, and after the release of Hank's book, that the Toronto Police Services are suddenly sort of waking up. Now we are going to listen to excerpts from my interview with Hank Idsinga on Saturday, March 7th, hours after the synagogue shootings had occurred. Hank, you woke up, and I was just kind of reading online mid to late afternoon today and was surprised and not to see that there were two shootings overnight, so on Friday night, maybe early Saturday morning, of synagogues, one in central Toronto, a very large Orthodox established congregation, another very large congregation, but in the northern suburbs of Toronto. Earlier in the week, there was another synagogue in Toronto that was shot. To my knowledge, there have been no arrests. Not much has really materialized from that first shooting. And now we have two fresh ones. And it's, again, shocking and not, because Jews in Toronto and in Canada have become chronic targets of violence and hatred. And that's what I want to talk to you about. You have so much experience in law enforcement, working in the Toronto Police Force. I have my views. I've not been shy about them, about how the police have been doing their job vis-a-vis the threats to the Jewish community and how they have not. How do you see it? How does a situation like this come to be in Toronto? I mean, we are the focus of so much negative international attention now. Toronto.
which is absolutely terrible, making international headlines on several fronts regarding what's going on in Toronto. It has been happening since October 7th, 2023. So for the last 2.5 years, essentially, we've seen a lot of missteps, I think, politically and through policing and enforcement of proper statutes when it comes to a lot of these issues. But really, since October 7th of 2023, the protest scene in Toronto has been out of control. And there's been a real lack of enforcement at a lot of these protests, a lack of leadership on the part of the Toronto Police, and certainly some very slanted leadership coming from other entities such as City Hall as well as the federal government. So not surprised to wake up this morning and hear about these shootings in Thornhill and in Toronto. Shocking, obviously, devastated. These literally are terrorism offenses, Viv. It's something that the entire nation here should be focused on and should be shutting down. But unfortunately, these mindsets have been really enabled through the lack of enforcement over the last 2.5 years, and really empowers the people who are doing this to do it and to continue to do it. And I'm sure you'll even see negative comments on social media today, ridiculousness such as false flag operation
Yeah.
and people doing this to themselves. And we saw the shooting earlier this week at Emmanuel Synagogue, and the deputy chief in Toronto standing up in front of the cameras and addressing it. And really, the communication there, I think it's a great example where the Jewish community, after listening to a police leader like that speak and address a shooting like that, should walk away with the feeling of, it's okay. The police have got this. They're on top of it. They're doing everything that they can. And the feedback I'm getting from the community and from what I see myself is that feeling isn't there. There's a real lack of confidence. There's a real lack of conviction, and people just aren't comfortable. And it shouldn't be that way. We've talked before, and I've said any member of the Jewish community at any given time should be able to walk down any street in Toronto and not have to fear for their safety. And unfortunately, that's certainly not the case over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I tend to share with you that the way in which the protests have been handled by police, law enforcement, and all levels of political leadership, right to the top in Ottawa, they've been emboldened, these peaceful protesters, and they're not peaceful protesters. They incite violence, they target Jews. You and I both, I think, share the view that there are a number of Criminal Code of Canada provisions that are very applicable in these situations, as well as many civil statutes. And this conduct that is threatening, that is violent, that is hateful, is not just allowed to continue week after week. It's these protesters who are actually protected by police. And I want to add just one more thing before I turn it back to you. I mean, the line from the beginning has been, oh, they're peaceful protesters exercising their constitutional rights. And that's just not true. They're not peaceful. There is no constitution, certainly not the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that protects conduct that incites hatred and violence and targets an identifiable group. So, politicians just and police leadership, they repeat these things like mantras, and it's just poppycock. You understand the institutional kind of mindset, culture of the Toronto Police Service. I mean, I think personally that this is way beyond them. They've never even tried to control or manage this. And in my view, it's now a national security issue. It's time for the Prime Minister to step up and do something. But here we are. For 2.5 years, Toronto Police have been acting as if they are dealing with it. Again, the culture, the mindset, the way they process things. I appreciate you're retired and you're not in the room anymore, but what do you surmise is going on?
I think there's a lot going on. I mean, we could probably spend an entire day, if not a couple of days, talking about the issues within. But, one of the analogies that I always like to use, especially when we see some of the comments that have been made at the command level about not bothering to lay charges because they just get withdrawn anyway. Getting legal advice that it doesn't meet the threshold of criminality, which is not the threshold the police operate on. The threshold police operate on is reasonable grounds that an offense has been committed. And not only that, you can also lay these charges. And so I think it's easy to come up with excuses as to why you're not doing something, as opposed to looking at a situation like we saw repeatedly over the last year in an area of Toronto known as Bathurst Manor, where protesters were breaking away from generally shouldn't have been, but was considered a lawful protest at the corner of Bathurst and Shepherd, and wandering through predominantly Jewish neighborhoods, intimidating people in their homes and,
I know.
at their residences. And police saying, well, there's really nothing we can do about that. And having the mindset, that's the easy way out, as opposed to looking at it and saying, okay, what tools do we have at our disposal? This needs to be addressed. This isn't right. This shouldn't be happening. On its face, we don't think there's a criminal charge here. What can we do to stop this? And really going through those tools and trying to find something that you can use to stop it and seeking the advice. You might seek advice from one lawyer who, unbeknownst to you or known to you, is an anti-Semite, say, oh, no, there's nothing you can do there. That's my legal advice. Legal advice is just that. It's advice. It doesn't mean you have to abide by it. Okay, I don't like that advice. I'm going to go talk to another lawyer. And like I said, some lawyers have stood up and said, no, it's intimidation. It's breach of the peace, right? There's all sorts of things you can do. We've seen some protesters walk into a protest with fake grenades hanging from their belts.
I mean,
And, police saying, well, there's nothing we can do, really. It's a fake grenade. Well, hold on a second. You do need some semblance or indication of violence for a breach of the peace charge. Is carrying a grenade, fake or not, violence? And some people would argue, no, it's not. Some people would argue, yes, it is. But like I said, you can get to that threshold of reasonable grounds based on that, and you can make those arrests. If you let it get to the point where people are literally letting off smoke grenades in Union Station in downtown Toronto, that's a big problem. And that should have been stomped out from day one. So it emboldens those protesters, and it leads to exactly what the community has been saying and what the community has been warning about for the last 2.5 years, to terrorism offenses where synagogues are repeatedly, and this week especially concerning, with 3 synagogues being shot at in the last 3 days,
yeah.
essentially. So scary situation, shouldn't have been happening, should have been stomped out from day one. It wasn't, and this is the result now. And you're seeing an awful lot of police cars now surrounding these synagogues where these incidents happened. We still haven't seen any response at all from Toronto Police Command. We saw some senior officers in York on the ground there at the synagogue. Good for York Police, which is the area just north of Toronto. And hopefully we see something from Toronto, but it's sad that it's gotten to this. I'd be very interested to know the results of ballistics analysis, for example, with these shootings. Is it the same gun that's being used? Is it the same caliber of gun that's being used? Especially when there's 2 shootings at 2 different synagogues in one night. And I think that would be information I want out to the public as soon as I possibly could. Right. You might not be able to definitively say it's the same gun, but it's the same caliber of gun. That's something that certainly could be put out, and communication is everything. So most of these incidents do get solved through the media and through tips and information coming in from witnesses. Discharging a firearm within the city of Toronto should be something that people can be caught for, can be arrested for, can be charged for, if the investigations are being done properly and prudently, and the assets are put in place where they can do that.
Yeah, there have been a number of incidents within the city of Toronto. Not all of them involve firearms, but quite a number over the last 2.5 years have involved firearms being discharged with a synagogue as the target. To my knowledge, and I'll of course double check this after, but there have not been any arrests in connection with the synagogue vandalism violence. There was, I believe, an arrest connected with a Jewish girls' school that was shot up 3 times before they seemed to figure out who was one of the suspects, and bulletproof windows were installed in this school. I also happen to know that the school's lost quite a number of students for obvious reasons. So, I mean, it's really interesting because, again, this is now an international story. Even in countries like the UK, where there have been terrible acts of violence targeting Jews, the police response has been much more serious, in my view, and quick. We saw the Bondi Beach massacre at a Hanukkah celebration on the beach in Sydney, Australia on December 14th. And it was horrifying. And as much as I disagree with the government of Australia with respect to how they deal with issues like antisemitism and Israel, they have responded and sharply with respect to helping to ensure the safety of Jewish Australians. They could do more, but they've been quite proactive. Right after the Bondi massacre, hours on that Sunday, December 14th, in Toronto, the same peaceful protesters showed up at Bathurst and Shepherd, that neighborhood in Toronto you were talking about, where I lived when I was little, and I know it very well. And not only did they show up, but they showed up speakers with microphones. One gentleman was singing a song in Arabic glorifying the murder of Jews and the destruction of Israel. A police officer in uniform stood around where he was and was, I mean, I have it on camera, smiling and having a great old time on a Sunday afternoon. And then later, members of this group that protests and threatens Jews constantly was escorted by police through the residential neighborhood, chanting their chants of violence and hatred targeting Jews and Israel. This happened hours after Bondi. And I have to say, I was sitting here in Israel, and I was certain that even Toronto Police Chief Myron Demke, even he would not allow this to happen on this day. And he did. How does a professional police force explain that?
It shouldn't be happening on that day. It shouldn't be happening on any day. It really shouldn't. And, I follow events in Australia, much like you do, and should not have taken the Bondi massacre for the government there to start acting. And in Toronto, it should not take a Bondi-like event for the government to start acting. And it shouldn't even take what we saw last night to get the government to start acting. 2.5 years, Viv, members of the Jewish community have been very vocal, standing up saying, you've got to do something because this is where it's going to lead to. And we've seen inaction to those voices. And now we see that it's actually evolved to that. And like you said, there's been previous shootings, there's been previous acts of vandalism targeting the community, there's been previous acts of violence. And it seems nothing has been done. Now, the police have laid a lot of charges in relation to some of these incidents, but the ones that stand out where things haven't been done that should have been done certainly are the protests. And to try and rationalize what has gone on within the Toronto Police Service to allow these things to happen, one of the glaring things, and you bring up Chief Myron Demke's name, is a real lack of leadership. A lot of these protests, you see the most senior officer there is, for example, a staff sergeant. right? So you've got constables, you've got sergeants, and then you have staff sergeants. And that would be the rank and file of the police service. And the rank above staff sergeant is that of inspector. And inspector and above would be senior officers within the Toronto Police Service.
Mm,
How many inspectors and above did we see at any of these protests? Well, very few, up until really after Bondi, we started to see inspectors once in a while at some of these protests, and they were usually brand new inspectors. I haven't seen any superintendents and above some of these protests. We certainly haven't seen any command officers.
mhm.
We certainly haven't seen the type of response we should be seeing at these protests. And I've said it many times on the radio. We know that there are protests every Sunday morning at Bathurst and Shepherd. I would expect every Sunday morning at 7:30 in the morning for a command level officer to be standing in front of the cameras and saying, okay, we are here. Here's how many police officers we've got here today, and here's what we're going to tolerate, and here's what we're not going to tolerate. And we have court wagons or paddy wagons, as you can see, parked on the street. And if anyone crosses the line, they're going to be arrested and they're going to be charged and processed. We've seen none of that. And simply doing something like that and communicating like that not only would give the community a huge amount of reassurance, right? But it would also probably put a bit of a crimp into the plans of some of these protesters. The
Right.
minute a bullhorn comes out or a microphone comes out, you're under arrest, right? There's no amplification devices, certainly no amplification devices within a residential neighborhood. And certainly, I don't expect your average police officer to understand the Arabic languages that are being spoken, sung at some of these protests. But I would certainly expect somebody with some expertise to be retained by the police service who can say to them, that's inciting hatred. Here's what they're saying. Whether it's something as simple as from the river to the sea to some of these songs that we're hearing sung, some signs that are being posted where your average citizen, your average police officer might not realize the hateful meaning behind those, but certainly experts and language experts would. And having those people at the police's disposal at some of these protests would be absolutely invaluable. We haven't seen it. We don't see it. Right. So there's so much more that could have been done,
Right.
that can be done. Very difficult to solve a shooting, not impossible. Odds are very good to solve it. I
Mhm.
would never stand up in front of the public and say, we're going to catch the guys who did this. I would
Right.
say, we're going to do everything we can to catch the guys who did this. As a matter of fact, here's what we're going to do. Really make sure that you are doing everything to get to that point.
And unfortunately, Hank, I mean, I think that looking at this 2.5 years later, what I see, and I make this statement in conclusion with great regret and reluctantly, I see a police force whose leadership views the protesters as having a constitutional right to do whatever the heck they please, that they are the priority when it comes to accommodation and support, not the targeted individuals. And looking at the conduct that's just gone on chronically, I mean, it's mind blowing to me. This is, the city that you and I both grew up in, Toronto the Good, they used to call it, right? Police officers were there, and their motto still is to serve and protect. But I don't think they're serving and protecting Jewish Canadians. And that's a very difficult conclusion to come to. I think that if you are a Jewish person in Toronto, you are not confident that law enforcement will protect you and will listen to you. And I think that's what we see demonstrated. I mean, if we have to wait for a Bondi Beach kind of, mass shooting to take place, and it will eventually, unfortunately. But you know what? I don't think that the police would even react. They'd say, "Oh, it's terrible, thoughts and prayers. This isn't who we are." And, carry on, you know? I don't have any confidence that there is anyone who is actually taking their very serious responsibility, seriously. And, as you said, a Toronto Police Chief says, well, it's this person or that person, or the lawyer's telling me this, or the mayor won't let me, do that. And like, this is completely out of hand. And I don't believe that this kind of conduct would be tolerated if it was any other religious or ethnic or national group that was being treated and targeted in this way.
I agree with you completely. And, sad to see that the communication from the police service is really following the political that we're seeing from the municipal government and the federal government as well. We're seeing, in the last week, we certainly saw the Prime Minister of Canada flip-flopping, I believe, 4 times now on his response to what's going
Yeah.
on in Iran, really preserving votes. And that shouldn't be the function of the police service. The police service should be out there. They should be out there enforcing the laws of the country without any bias or preference to any particular group. And sadly, we're definitely seeing the two-tier policing, and we've seen it for the last 2.5 years, and that simply should not be happening.
I have to say, I'm in Toronto not infrequently, less frequently now, but on 2 occasions, I've been to many of these protest demonstrations, and once it was outside the courthouse, 361 University downtown, the main courthouse, and it was a big demonstration protest, and a police officer came over to me and told me, "You have to stand over there." Now, I'm not wearing anything that demonstrates any political, religious, any identification. I'm just a person. But I guess because I was not wearing a keffiyeh or carrying a Palestinian flag, he assumed that I was with the other. And I challenged him and I said, "Why?" "Well, that's where your group is." "What group?" Like, it was just horrendous. I'm like, you've decided I'm a Jew and I go with the Jews. So, of course, I just walked off in the other direction and went right into the middle of the demonstration because I wanted to make a point, and I also wanted to see what they were doing and what they were saying. Like, I wanted to be right inside. On another occasion, I went to see the premiere at the Toronto Film Festival of a film that caused a lot of controversy. And it was a film about a retired general in the IDF who rescued his son and his son's young family. They were on a kibbutz that was being attacked by Hamas. I went down, and there were huge protests all around Roy Thompson Hall, where the movie was being premiered at the film festival. And it was aggressive, and it was loud, and there were hateful chants and slogans, and the street was blocked. And I went over to a police officer, and I asked him, "Is there a reason this is allowed to continue?" And I appreciate they're the rank and file. I get what you say. But still, it's a police officer, and he's here. And he said, "Well, they're not doing nothing. They're not breaking the law. Everything's fine." And I said, "Do you hear what they're saying, though? I mean, I'm Jewish, and it's very threatening and violent speech." And he informed me that the perception of threats and violence are subjective. It's a subjective test. So I said to him, "Wow, is that what management is telling you guys to stay out on the street?" I mean, I tried to kind of make light of it, but it was like, that's just not good enough. It's just not good enough. You tell your supervisor that is not good enough, especially from a police officer. I felt badly for the guy. I was very nice to him, but those are just 2 anecdotal, encounters I had, and I'm not there every week. And you and I have both heard much worse stories.
If the speech is subjective, it's not the police who should be making that call, it's the courts. Like I said, the threshold is reasonable grounds.
Yep.
And quite frankly, Vivian, if you're walking down University Avenue near the American Embassy in Toronto and there's a huge Palestinian or pro IRGC protest happening outside that embassy and there's police officers there, and you walked up and they realized you were Jewish and you wanted to walk down University Avenue, like I said at
Uh-huh.
the beginning, take my arm. I'm going to walk you right down University Avenue, and you shouldn't feel unsafe whatsoever. You shouldn't feel unsafe anywhere in the city whatsoever. And sadly, that's
Doesn't
not
happen.
happening.
I've traveled a fair bit in Europe. I spent quite a bit of time in the last 2.5 years in Berlin, a city which I happen to love and which also has a lot of demonstrations. And the contrast between the way in which the Berlin police handle these demonstrations and Toronto police is night and day. And what you just said is exactly what happens. And so when I would go to these demonstrations with the intention of observing, of writing, of filming, whatever it is I choose to do at that particular moment, I would always go over initially to one of the police officers and just introduce myself, tell them why I'm there. I'm not there to cause any trouble, but everything I'm doing is legal, lawful. And they were a police officer, polite, professional, courteous. They all spoke English. And they said, you are doing nothing wrong by being here. And just stay close to us and we'll make sure that they don't bother you. And when they did come over to harass me, the peaceful protesters, the police officers were right on them and moved them away. And I was never told, go stand over there with the Jews, because there are, often sort of segregated areas where pro-Israel protesters would go. But no, I was not once treated in that way. And they were vigilant, as they should have been, in ensuring that I was safe. And they said to the protesters, because they said, get her, tell her to get out of here. She shouldn't be here. She can't. They were like, she's not doing anything wrong. Nothing. He just handled it. And I've never seen that in Toronto.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen some great footage coming out of especially Berlin, some good footage coming out of Amsterdam, some very poor footage coming out of Amsterdam as well, unfortunately, but definitely a different way of doing business. And like I said, the focus should be on protecting all members of the community everywhere and making sure people feel safe and using communication as a very strong tool to do that. Presence helps, but certainly presence standing around not doing anything isn't going to help at all. So,
well, Hank Idsinga, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. And for sharing your experience and insights so openly. So, Chief Demke, if you're listening, maybe it's time to shake things up a little, huh? Thanks, Hank.
Thanks, Vivian. Pleasure, and we'll definitely chat again.
Look forward to it. And that's a wrap for today. Thanks for being here, as always, and please, if you do not already support our work with a paid subscription, it would make a huge difference if you can and would consider doing so. Or make a contribution to buy me a coffee. All the information is on our website, stateoftelaviv.com. Producing this content takes a lot of time and effort, and State of Tel Aviv and Beyond is an independent media outlet. If you're still listening, well, that means a lot. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to vivian@stateoftelaviv.com. That's VIVIAN @stateoftelaviv.com. And if you go to our website, stateoftelaviv.com, you can find the subscribe button and take it from there. Hope that you do that. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything. Thank you, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team, and thank you, listeners, for being here. Until next time, stay safe.